There are truths that only reveal themselves when everything we know falls apart. In the unforgiving heartland, where the earth is both cradle and tomb, fortunes are built on the bedrock of grit and destroyed by the subtle poison of greed. This is the story of a man stripped to his foundations, left with nothing but the ghosts of a legacy and a pile of rust. It is a story of how the engine of revenge, when fueled by desperation, can generate a power the world has never seen. The smell of success in Marcus Gentry's office was a sterile, curated thing, an atmosphere engineered to suffocate hope. It was a calculated blend of polished mahogany, aged leather from chairs that had never known a working man's posture, and the faint, antiseptic tang of money so clean it had never known the touch of soil or sweat. It was an alien air that seized Leo Miller's lungs, tightening his throat as he stood on the Persian rug, his scuffed work boots feeling like anchors of dirt in a pristine, bloodless sea. He was an intruder here, a piece of the crude, messy world that men like Gentry paid to keep at a distance. For 6 relentless weeks, Leo had lived and breathed Gentry's fleet of agricultural titans, gleaming John Deere combines and colossal case IH tractors. He hadn't just serviced them, he had performed miracles of mechanical resurrection. He'd rebuilt transmissions that were actively chewing themselves to pieces, their gears screaming in protest. He'd meticulously rewired complex electrical systems fried by a summer lightning strike, a task Gentry's own certified technicians had declared impossible. He had tuned diesel engines until their thunderous roars softened into the purr of contented lions, their power smooth and absolute. He had poured every ounce of his skill, his focus, the very marrow of his being into the work, driven by a pride inherited from 3 generations of Miller men. The invoice for $10,000 sat on the corner of Gentry's massive desk. It was a flimsy piece of paper, a ghost of his labor, representing the only barricade standing between his family's century-old workshop and a foreclosure notice from the bank, a notice that felt less like a document and more like a death warrant. Marcus Gentry, a man whose tailored suit cost more than Leo's truck, swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass, the ice clinking with a sound of languid finality. He did not look at Leo. His gaze was fixed on a point somewhere beyond the room, a horizon of profit and power that a man like Leo could never comprehend. He looked through him, as if Leo were a ghost haunting the edges of his opulent world, a smudge on the glass of his perfect life. "The work is done," Gentry said, his voice a smooth, dismissive baritone that slid across the room like oil on glass. "Your services are no longer required." The words were delivered with the same casual indifference he might use to dismiss a servant. The polite, professional shell Leo had constructed around his desperation began to crack. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of panic. "Yes, sir. The work is finished. The invoice," he began, his voice tight. Gentry finally lifted his gaze, and the full force of his contempt met Leo. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, cold, empty, and vast with indifference. A small, cruel smile, a razor-thin curve of his lips appeared. "Invoice?" he repeated, the word dripping with mock curiosity. "Son, I'm running a multinational agricultural business, not a charity for local grease monkeys. I had my own people look over your work after you left." He paused, letting the lie settle in the silent room. "Shoddy, barely adequate. I've already had to order replacements for half the parts you claim to have fixed." The lie was so blatant, so audacious, it was like a physical blow, stealing the air from Leo's lungs. A hot, sickening wave of disbelief and rage washed over him. He had used only top-of-the-line OEM-spec components, sourcing them with the last vestiges of credit his family name held in the county. His work was meticulous, a point of sacred honor. It was the one thing in his chaotic, debt-ridden life that was perfect. That's not true, Mr. Gentry," he stammered, the words feeling clumsy and weak against the man's polished falsehood. "I have the receipts for every part, the diagnostic printouts before and after." Gentry waved a dismissive hand, the large gold signet ring on his pinky flashing like a warning. "Paperwork. Anyone can fake paperwork. The fact is, your work isn't worth what you're asking. It isn't worth half of it." He rose from his leather throne, his movements fluid and predatory, and walked to the large bay window that overlooked his kingdom. Thousands of acres of perfect, mathematically precise rows of corn, a green and gold ocean that stretched to the horizon. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives are just the universe preparing us for who we're meant to become. Gentry saw a testament to his power. Leo saw the source of his ruin. "I need that money," Leo said, his voice finally cracking, betraying a desperation he despised. The words sounded pathetic, pleading, and he hated himself for them. "My family's shop, the bank." "Your family's problems are not my concern," Gentry cut in, his tone a razor's edge. He turned back from the window, that venomous smile returning, wider this time, as if he savored the taste of Leo's despair. "But I'm not an unreasonable man." He walked back to the desk, his presence filling the room, shrinking Leo's world to the size of this single, humiliating moment. "You want payment? Fine. There's a piece of junk out in the back 40 by the old lightning-struck oak. Been sitting there since my grandfather's time. A rusted-out tractor carcass. You can have it. For your trouble, tow it away. That's what your 6 weeks of sweat is worth to me." He picked up the invoice, the symbol of Leo's hope. With a deliberate, theatrical slowness, he tore it cleanly in half, the sound of ripping paper as loud as a gunshot in the silent office. He let the 2 pieces flutter from his manicured fingers into the gilded wastebasket. "Now get off my property." The drive back to his own world was a descent into a waking nightmare. Leo's old Ford pickup rattled and groaned, a symphony of its own failing parts that seemed to mock his failure as a mechanic. He didn't tow the tractor. Not yet. The humiliation was a physical weight, a crushing pressure on his chest that made each breath a conscious, ragged effort. He hadn't just been denied payment, he'd been dismissed, erased. His skill, his pride, the legacy of his father Samuel and his grandfather Thomas, who had built their workshop from the ground up with calloused hands and unwavering integrity. All of it had been weighed, measured, and equated to a pile of scrap metal. Bankrupt, finished, over. The words echoed in his skull, each one a hammer blow against his crumbling resolve. He felt hollowed out, a walking shell of a man whose soul had just been repossessed. When he pulled into the gravel driveway of Miller and Son Mechanics, the sign, its paint faded and peeling like sunburnt skin, seemed to sag in shame. His father was waiting on the porch, a silhouette against the dying light. Samuel was a man carved from oak and quiet disappointment. His hands, though gnarled and twisted with the fire of arthritis, still held the memory and wisdom of 1,000 engines. He saw the utter devastation on Leo's face, the deadness in his eyes, and he didn't need to ask. The question had already been answered. "He didn't pay," Samuel stated. It wasn't a question, it was a verdict. His voice was raspy, filled with the dust of the years and the rust of broken dreams. Leo could only shake his head, the shame burning so hot behind his eyes it felt like it would incinerate him from the inside out. He couldn't bring himself to say the words, to voice the full, poisonous extent of the insult. To speak it aloud would be to make it irrevocably real. The next morning, driven by a flicker of something he couldn't name, not hope, but something harder, colder. Pride, defiance, or maybe just the sheer, stubborn inability to let Marcus Gentry have the final, crushing word. Leo drove his sputtering truck back out to the Gentry estate. He didn't go to the main house. The memory of the office was a fresh, bleeding wound. Instead, he took the rutted dirt track that led to the back 40. And there it was. It was worse than he'd imagined. It sat under the sprawling, skeletal branches of an ancient oak tree, looking less like a machine and more like a fossil, a part of the landscape that time had forgotten to bury. Rust had eaten through most of the body panels, leaving them looking like burnt orange lace, fragile and rotten. 4 flat tires had long ago surrendered their shape, melting into the dark earth. Thick, thorny vines snaked their way through the wheel wells and up into the engine cavity, binding it to the ground like a captured beast. It was a skeleton, picked clean by the vultures of time and neglect. It was the perfect monument to his own failure. He backed his truck up, the tow chain clinking like a funeral dirge. The metal links groaned in protest as he hooked them to the tractor's rusted frame. The entire process felt like a funeral procession. He was towing his own shame, a 10-ton effigy of his worthlessness, back to the one place that was supposed to be his sanctuary. When he finally dragged the carcass into the yard of the workshop, his father came out, wiping his greasy hands on an already blackened rag. He circled the wreck slowly, his expression a grim mixture of pity and raw frustration. "What in God's name is this, Leo?" "Payment," Leo mumbled, the word tasting like ash and bile in his mouth. Samuel delivered a swift, angry kick to one of the rotted tires, which disintegrated into a puff of black dust. "This is an insult. He spit in your face and you brought it home with you. Call a scrapper. You might get $50 for it. It's more than Gentry thinks you're worth anyway." The words, meant to be a condemnation of Gentry, struck Leo like a slap. His own father saw it the same way. Trash. Worthless. He felt his heart sink into a cold, dark place inside his chest. But as he stood there, watching the late afternoon sun glint off the oxidized metal, something caught his eye. A detail. It wasn't the general shape of the hood or the frame, which were common enough for a machine of that forgotten era. It was the engine block. Peeking through a tangled nest of rusted pipes and petrified hoses was a shape he'd never seen before in his life. It was compact, unusually so for a tractor of this size, and the casting was different. The lines were too clean, the geometry too deliberate. It wasn't the brute force, overbuilt engineering of the 1950s or 60s. It felt more precise, more elegant, like something designed not for agriculture but for a race track. "Wait," Leo said, his voice barely a whisper, a strange new energy cutting through his despair. He grabbed a long crowbar from the bed of his truck and jammed it under the rusted engine cowling. He put his weight into it, and the metal screeched in protest, then tore away with a sound of final surrender, revealing more of the block. His eyes widened. It was a V8, but the cylinder heads were massive, and the intake manifold was unlike anything he'd ever encountered in any textbook or workshop manual. It wasn't designed for simple, low-end torque to pull a plow. It was designed for power. Raw, unadulterated, earth-shattering power. "What is it?" Samuel asked, leaning in closer. His ingrained mechanical curiosity piqued despite his anger. "I don't know," Leo admitted, running a hand over the corroded metal, feeling the strange, elegant contours beneath the layers of grime and decay. "But it's not normal." For the first time in 24 hours, the crushing weight on his chest lifted, just an inch, replaced by a tiny, fragile spark of intrigue. This wasn't just junk. Gentry, in his towering, blinding arrogance, had made a mistake. He thought he was giving Leo trash. Instead, he had given him a puzzle. And if there was one thing Leo Miller knew how to do, it was solve puzzles made of steel and iron. This puzzle just might be the key to his survival, or the final nail in his coffin. The first week was an archeological dig into his own ruin. Leo worked under the dim, flickering glow of the workshop's fluorescent lights, the official foreclosure notice taped to the main tool cabinet like a death sentence with a firm deadline. It was a constant, taunting reminder of the ticking clock. Every cent he had was gone. The 10,000 from Gentry was supposed to have been the miracle, the 11th hour reprieve from the cavalry that was never coming. Now all he had was this project, this insult. He started with the basics, using a high-pressure hose to blast away decades of caked-on mud, bird droppings, and organic decay. Water, dark brown and gritty, ran in thick rivers across the stained concrete floor, carrying away the past. He spent 2 full days just freeing the wheels from the petrified rubber and hubs that had rusted solid to the axles, the violent screech of the impact wrench echoing the raw protest in his own bones. He worked until his arms trembled with exhaustion, until his hands were raw and bleeding. But he didn't stop. His father watched from a distance, a silent, mournful spectator to what he saw as his son's descent into madness. Samuel would sit on an overturned bucket just inside the workshop doors, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, his face a mask of weary sorrow. "You're wasting your time, son," he'd say, his voice heavy with a weary kindness that felt infinitely worse than anger. "The bank's representative is coming in 3 weeks. We need cash, not another mouth to feed." Leo knew he was right. Every logical part of his brain, the part that understood profit margins and due dates, screamed it at him. He was polishing trash while his family's legacy, the physical embodiment of his grandfather's American dream, crumbled to dust around him. Desperation became his currency. He started selling off non-essential tools on internet forums, each sale a small betrayal of his heritage. A spare welding kit his grandfather had cherished. A set of antique, perfectly machined wrenches. The cash wasn't saved. It was immediately consumed. It went to keep the lights on and to buy cheap, potent, penetrating oil by the gallon. His world shrank. His meals became a grim rotation of canned beans eaten cold, stale bread, and the bitter, overbrewed coffee he made on a hot plate in the corner. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford, snatched in 2-hour increments on a greasy cot he'd set up next to the tractor's carcass. The cloying, metallic smell of rust and oil his only companion. The community, which had once respected the Miller workshop as an institution, now saw him as a fool, a local tragedy. Old Man Hemlock from the sprawling farm next door would lean on the dividing fence, chewing on a piece of straw, his eyes filled with a kind of pitying contempt. "Polishing a turd won't make it shine, Leo," he'd drawl, a cruel smirk playing on his weathered face. The phrase, sharp and dismissive, caught on like a virus. Soon, the local kids riding their bikes down the dusty lane would shout it as they passed, their voices high and mocking. "Hey Leo, how's that turd shining?" Each jeer was a fresh cut into his already flayed pride. He wanted to scream at them, to grab them by the collar and force them to see what he saw. They saw a heap of rust, an undeniable symbol of his complete and utter failure. But Leo, as he stripped away the layers of decay, was beginning to see something else. A story was emerging from the steel. The frame wasn't standard-issue farm equipment. It was heavily reinforced, with welds so clean and precise they could only have been done by a master craftsman, not a mass-production line. The suspension, what little was left of it, hinted at a radical design meant to handle immense, unprecedented torque, far more than any tractor of its era would ever need. It was an enigma wrapped in rust, and it was calling to him. The struggle was immense, a physical war against time and decay. A single seized piston in cylinder 3 became his personal mini-boss. It took him 4 days of constant, brutal effort to free it. He broke 3 professional-grade puller tools, the metal shrieking and then snapping under the strain. He tore the skin from his knuckles, his blood mixing with the grease and rust until his hands were a raw, crimson mess. On the fourth night, he lay on his back on the cold concrete under the engine block, his arms aching with a fire that went bone deep, his vision blurred with sweat and exhaustion. For a moment, he let the despair he had been holding at bay wash over him in a black, suffocating tide. Hemlock was right. His father was right. He was a fool, chasing a ghost in a machine while the real world, the world of banks and deadlines, prepared to evict him from his life. He closed his eyes, the cold of the concrete seeping into his spine. He saw Gentry's smug, dismissive face. He heard the crisp, final sound of the torn invoice fluttering into the trash, and the spark of defiance that had flickered within him roared into a bonfire. He would not be beaten. He would not let Gentry's casual, thoughtless cruelty be the final word on his family's name. This machine, this pile of junk, was the only thing he had left to fight with. It was his sword, his shield, his last, desperate, insane stand. With a groan, he pushed himself up, wiped the blood from his hands on his filthy jeans, and went back to work. His meager budget for food was rerouted. He began sharing it, not on better food for himself, but on parts for the machine. He couldn't afford new ones, so he became a scavenger, a connoisseur of scrap. He spent hours at regional scrap yards, sifting through mountains of twisted metal under a punishing sun, his eyes peeled for a compatible bearing, a usable gear, anything that could be salvaged and repurposed. He drove 100 miles to a specialty machine shop in the city to buy a single, custom-milled gasket, paying for it with the last of the money he'd gotten for his grandfather's wrenches. The tractor wasn't just a project anymore. It was a living, breathing thing, and he was feeding it pieces of his own life, piece by painful, sacrificial piece. The true transformation began when he finally managed to lift the monstrous engine block from the chassis with an old chain hoist. The hoist groaned under the unexpected weight, the chain stretched taut like overwrought tendons, the links screaming in protest. He secured it to a stand in the center of the workshop, where it sat like a strange, industrial heart awaiting a transplant, the focal point of his entire existence. This was the puzzle box he had first glimpsed through the vines, and now he could finally begin to unlock its secrets. For days, he did nothing but clean. He became an artist of restoration. He used wire brushes, potent solvents, delicate dental picks, and a high-pressure compressed air hose, meticulously removing every speck of rust and grime that had accumulated over half a century. It was a form of meditation, a purification ritual. With each flake of orange rust that fell away to reveal the clean, dark steel beneath, he felt like he was clearing away his own doubt, his own humiliation. He worked until his fingers were numb and his back was a single, solid knot of agony. He lost track of time, the cycle of day and night marked only by the shifting parallelogram of light that moved across the floor from the workshop's grimy windows. The world outside, with its mockery and its deadlines, ceased to exist. There was only the steel, the grease, and the slow, painstaking process of revelation. He was no longer just a mechanic. He was a restorer, an archeologist, bringing a lost relic back from the dead. And he was getting closer to its secret. He could feel it in his bones. The engine was whispering to him, and he was finally, after all these years of working on other people's machines, beginning to understand its language. The third week of the restoration was a blur of exhaustion and manic obsession. Leo had lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, his cheekbones becoming sharp angles under skin perpetually smudged with grease. The workshop had become his entire universe, a cavern filled with the metallic scent of solvents and the ghosts of 1,000 past machines. The foreclosure notice on the tool cabinet seemed to have grown larger, its red lettering a glaring accusation. 2 weeks left, but his focus was singular, narrowed to the engine block mounted on its stand, a dark idol in the center of his shrinking world. He had cleaned the exterior, revealing the strange, elegant lines of the casting, but he knew the heart of the mystery, the engine's true identity, lay within, hidden from view. He was working on the lower part of the block, near the oil pan mount, a section so caked with hardened, ancient grease it was like chipping away at stone. The grime had petrified over the decades, becoming a protective shell. He used a small, sharp scraper, the rhythmic metal-on-metal sound a soft, hypnotic asterisk shink, shink asterisk in the otherwise silent shop. The work was tedious, straining his eyes in the poor light, each movement a small act of faith. He was about to give up for the night, his stomach a hollow cavern growling with a hunger he'd long since learned to ignore, when his scraper hit something that wasn't cast iron. It made a different sound, a dull thud instead of a scrape, and the material beneath felt different, smoother. He squinted, leaning closer, and saw a faint, silvery glint under the grime. His breath caught in his throat. His heart, which had been beating with the slow, steady rhythm of fatigue, suddenly hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He fumbled for a rag and a bottle of solvent, his hands trembling slightly with a jolt of adrenaline. He sprayed the area, the chemical hissing as it aggressively dissolved the ancient grease. He wiped it away, then sprayed and wiped again, his movements becoming more frantic. Slowly, like an image developing in a darkroom, letters began to emerge, stamped into a small, rectangular brass plate that had been perfectly, seamlessly inset into the block, designed to be almost invisible. The first letter was a P, then an H, an O, and E. His heart pounded in his ears. He worked faster, scrubbing with the rag, his movements frantic now, a wild hope warring with disbelief. The word emerged, Phoenix. His mind raced, a frantic scramble through every manufacturer's catalog he'd ever seen. Phoenix. He'd never heard of a tractor manufacturer called Phoenix. It must be a model name, but from what company? Below the name there was another set of characters, smaller, finer. He scrubbed at them, his knuckles raw against the rough casting. A dash and then 3 digits. 1. Phoenix 1. The tools slipped from his numb fingers and clattered onto the concrete floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cavernous silence. Leo stumbled back, his legs weak, staring at the plate as if it were a venomous snake poised to strike. It couldn't be. It was the stuff of legends, a ghost story told by old engineers. It was impossible. He scrambled over to the corner where a dusty, ancient computer sat on a cluttered workbench. He wiped his filth-caked hands on his jeans, leaving dark streaks on the denim, and booted it up. The dial-up modem shrieked to life, a discordant, alien sound from another era, a fitting soundtrack for the history he was about to uncover. He typed Phoenix 1 tractor into the search bar. The results were sparse, fragmented pieces of a forgotten legend, scattered across obscure engineering forums and the digital archives of old farm journals. But they were there. The Iron Phoenix was not a product, it was a myth, a secret project from the late 1960s, funded by a maverick aerospace engineer named Alastair Finch. Finch was a visionary, a man who believed that the principles of high-performance racing engines could be adapted for agricultural use, creating a machine with unparalleled power and efficiency that could revolutionize global farming. He designed a revolutionary engine, a compact V8 that used a novel fuel injection system and a variable geometry combustion chamber, technology that was decades ahead of its time, alien to the world of carburetors and push rods. He built one prototype, just one. He called it the Phoenix 1, a machine destined to rise from the ashes of old, inefficient technology. According to the fragmented forum posts, Finch demonstrated it once at a private event for potential investors, where it reportedly outperformed every other machine on the market by a factor of 3, pulling loads that should have been impossible. But then disaster struck. Finch's company went bankrupt, the victim of a rival's brutal corporate espionage that saw his designs stolen and his funding pulled overnight. The prototype, his life's work, vanished without a trace. Most believed it had been unceremoniously scrapped, its secrets lost forever. It had become a holy grail for vintage machinery collectors and engineering historians, a ghost story whispered in old barns and workshops. Leo stared at the glowing screen, then back at the engine block sitting in the middle of his workshop. The unique casting, the reinforced frame, the advanced suspension design, it all clicked into place with the force of a revelation. This wasn't a pile of junk. It wasn't a failed experiment. It was a masterpiece, a lost legend, the one and only Iron Phoenix. Gentry, in his blind, suffocating arrogance, had thrown away a priceless piece of engineering history. He hadn't just given Leo a tractor, he'd given him a weapon. A wave of adrenaline, pure and potent, surged through him, a chemical fire that washed away the weeks of exhaustion and the gnawing hunger. He was no longer a victim. He wasn't a fool polishing trash. He was the custodian of a legend. The foreclosure notice, the mocking neighbors, the crushing weight of his failure. It all seemed small, insignificant in the face of this impossible discovery. He looked at his hands, stained with the grease and rust of the Phoenix, the skin torn and bleeding. He had been trying to save his family's workshop. But maybe, just maybe, this machine was here to save him. The sound of Marcus Gentry's dismissive laughter echoed in his memory, but now it sounded different. It sounded like the hollow, ignorant cackle of a man who had just thrown away a winning lottery ticket. And Leo was the one who had just picked it up off the ground. The news spread through the county like a wildfire in a dry field. The flyer, printed in garish red and yellow, was pinned to the bulletin board at the feed store, a splash of aggressive color against the faded business cards and lost pet notices. The annual state tractor pull was back, bigger than ever, with a grand prize of $25,000. For most farmers and mechanics in the region, it was a day of community pride, cheap beer and barbecue smoke. For Leo, holding the flyer in his trembling hand, it was a revelation. A sign. $25,000. It wasn't just enough. It was more than double what he needed to pay off the bank and secure the workshop for another year. It was a lifeline thrown into the abyss. But it wasn't just about the money. Not anymore. The tractor pull was the biggest stage in their world. It was a crucible where reputations were forged in diesel smoke and broken by the inexorable weight of the sled. And Leo knew, with a cold, hard certainty that settled deep in his bones, that Marcus Gentry would be there. Gentry didn't just own farms. He owned a reputation for dominance. He sponsored local events, had his name plastered on the scoreboard of the high school baseball field, and always entered the most expensive, ostentatious machine in the tractor pull. It was his annual coronation, a public spectacle designed to reinforce his position at the top of the food chain. The thought of it made Leo's blood run hot with a purpose he hadn't felt in years: to beat Gentry, not in his sterile office, not with weak words and useless paperwork, but in the arena he considered his own personal coliseum. To do it with the very piece of junk Gentry had used to humiliate him. The symmetrical poetry of it was too perfect, too potent to ignore. It was a chance not just for survival, but for retribution. He spent the next 2 weeks in a state of controlled fury, a white-hot crucible of work. The discovery of the tractor's identity had changed everything. He was no longer just repairing a machine. He was resurrecting a legend, becoming a high priest to an iron god. He worked with a reverence he'd never felt before. Every part he cleaned, every bolt he torqued to its precise specification, was an act of honor to Alastair Finch's forgotten genius. The engine, once reassembled with scavenged and custom-fabricated parts, was a work of brutalist art. The revolutionary fuel injection system, a delicate and complex marvel, was miraculously intact, having been protected for 50 years by layers of hardened grease. He had to fabricate a new wiring harness from scratch, spending 3 solid days painstakingly soldering each connection, his movements guided by old, grainy schematics he'd found on a historian's deep web forum. He poured the last of his money, the cash from selling a prized air compressor, into 5 gallons of diesel and a canister of high-grade synthetic oil. The day he was ready to start it for the first time, his father stood by the workshop door, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of profound skepticism. "Leo, don't get your hopes up," Samuel warned, his voice gentle but firm. "An engine that sat for half a century, it's a miracle if it doesn't seize up solid and throw a rod right through the block." Leo didn't answer. He climbed onto the hard steel seat, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. This was the moment. It would either live or die. He took a deep, steadying breath, turned the key he had fashioned himself from a blank and pressed the ignition button. For a long moment, there was nothing but the pathetic, high-pitched whine of the starter motor straining against the engine's inertia. Then a cough, a violent shudder. A single puff of thick, black smoke belched from the custom exhaust pipe he'd welded together. And then it happened. The engine caught. It didn't roar to life like a modern machine. It awoke. A low, deep growl rumbled through the workshop, a primal sound that vibrated not just in the air, but up through the concrete floor, in the tools hanging on the walls, in the very marrow of Leo's bones. It was a sound unlike any tractor engine he had ever heard. It was smoother, deeper, with a menacing, predatory edge, like a sleeping carnivore stirring from a long, deep slumber. The variable geometry combustion chambers, Finch's secret weapon, began to hum with a unique, resonant frequency that was both beautiful and terrifying. Samuel's jaw dropped. He took a hesitant step forward, his eyes wide with utter disbelief. "My God," he whispered, the words barely audible over the engine's thrum. "What is that?" Leo just smiled, a real, genuine smile for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. It was a smile of relief, of triumph, of vindication. "That," he said, his voice rising over the incredible, ground-shaking thrum of the engine, "is the Iron Phoenix." The day of the tractor pull was brutally hot and dusty, the sun a merciless hammer in a bleached white sky. The county fairgrounds were packed, a sprawling sea of plaid shirts, denim jeans, and faces etched with hopeful anticipation. The air was a thick, heady cocktail of diesel exhaust, grilled burgers, and the electric tang of nervous excitement. In the staging area, the machines were lined up like titans of the modern agricultural age. Gleaming, massive tractors with price tags that could buy a house, their paint jobs flawless, their chrome blinding. And at the head of the line, polished to a mirror shine that seemed to suck in the light, was Gentry's entry. A brand new, top-of-the-line Fendt 1000 Vario, a $500,000 marvel of German engineering, painted a deep, arrogant black. Then Leo pulled in. The Iron Phoenix was a jarring, brutalist anomaly in the polished lineup. He hadn't had the time or the money for a paint job. Its body was a raw, honest patchwork of sanded steel, exposed welds still showing their heat bluing, and patches of the original, faded paint. It looked brutal, scarred, functional, and utterly out of place. It looked like exactly what Gentry had called it, a pile of junk. A hush fell over the nearby crowd as Leo maneuvered the Phoenix into its designated spot. Then, the hush was broken by a single, booming laugh that cut through the air. It was Marcus Gentry. He strode over from his own machine, flanked by a few of his corporate cronies, all of them smirking with the easy confidence of men who have never known failure. "Well, I'll be," Gentry boomed, his voice loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear, a deliberate public performance. "Look what the cat dragged in. You actually brought that rust bucket here. I thought you'd have had the good sense to sell it for scrap by now." Leo felt 100 pairs of eyes on him. The familiar, sickening heat of humiliation crept up his neck. He stayed on the tractor's seat, looking down at Gentry, his face a stony, unreadable mask. He didn't say a word. His silence, his refusal to be baited, seemed to infuriate Gentry more than any retort could have. "Boys, you see this?" Gentry gestured dramatically at the Phoenix, playing to the crowd. "This is what happens when you let a backyard mechanic touch real machinery. He gets delusions of grandeur." He reached into the pocket of his tailored slacks and pulled out a thick roll of cash, peeling off $100 bills with a flourish. "I'll bet anyone here $500 that thing won't even start. 1,000 says it can't pull the sled 10 feet. The crowd murmured, a mix of amusement and pity. A few of Gentry's friends laughed and eagerly took the bet, the exchange of money loud and ostentatious. Old Man Hemlock was there, leaning against a fence post, a look of pitying amusement on his face. The mockery was a physical force, a wave of negativity pressing in on Leo from all sides. For a terrifying second, his own carefully suppressed doubts resurfaced. What if his father was right? What if it threw a rod? What if all his work, his sacrifice, his desperate hope ended right here in a cloud of engine smoke and public ridicule? He gripped the simple steel steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. This was it, the showdown. It was no longer about the money. It was about honor. It was about proving that value isn't something you can buy, it's something you build with your own 2 hands. The announcer's voice, distorted and tinny, crackled over the PA system, calling the first contestant. It was Gentry. He climbed into the climate-controlled, soundproof cab of his Fendt, giving Leo a final, condescending wink. The black beast moved to the starting line with a silent, electric hum, a testament to its advanced, soulless technology. The sled, a massive metal platform loaded with an initial 20,000 pounds of weight, was hooked to its hitch. The green flag dropped. Gentry's fence surged forward with an effortless display of power. Its massive tires, a technological marvel in their own right, dug into the packed dirt track, and the sled began to move. It was an impressive, almost arrogant display of overwhelming force. But just as it passed the 150-foot mark, a series of sharp, frantic beeps echoed from its cab. A red light began to flash on its complex dashboard. The engine sputtered, choked on its own precision, and then died with an anticlimactic sigh of escaping air. A sensor malfunction. A tiny $1 piece of silicon had crippled the $500,000 machine. A wave of frustrated murmurs rippled through the crowd. Inside his glass box, Gentry slammed his fist against the steering wheel, his face turning a shade of purple that clashed violently with his expensive polo shirt. "Next up," the announcer's voice boomed, now laced with a hint of surprise and amusement, Leo Miller with the Iron Phoenix. This was it. A slow, heavy silence descended upon the fairgrounds. The laughter and mockery had been replaced by a tense, expectant curiosity. Leo drove the Phoenix to the line, the old steel groaning, the engine rumbling with its deep, unusual rhythm. He could feel Gentry's furious, humiliated glare burning into the back of his neck. The official hooked the massive chain from the sled to the Phoenix's simple, overbuilt hitch. The weight felt immense, a physical manifestation of the anchor that had been threatening to pull him down into failure for months. He reached into his pocket and touched the folded foreclosure notice he had tucked there that morning. He thought of his father's worried face, now watching from the sidelines. He thought of Alistair Finch's lost dream. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and diesel and possibility. The green flag dropped. Leo didn't slam the throttle. He eased into it, feeding power to the engine slowly, respectfully, as if coaxing a wild animal. The initial growl deepened, the unique hum of the combustion chambers rising in pitch and volume. It wasn't the high RPM scream of a modern engine, but a symphony of controlled explosions, a ground-shaking roar that felt like it was coming from the center of the earth. The sound was alien, powerful, captivating. The crowd, which had been expecting a pathetic sputter, went dead silent, mesmerized. The Phoenix strained against the dead weight. The massive, custom-treaded tires he'd salvaged and re-grooved himself by hand began to bite into the dirt. For a heart-stopping moment, they spun, kicking up thick clouds of brown dust. Leo didn't panic. He adjusted the throttle with a surgeon's touch, feeling the machine talk to him through the vibrations in the seat and the steering wheel. He found the sweet spot, the perfect balance of power and traction. The tires gripped, and the sled began to move. It wasn't a violent lurch like the other tractors. It was a smooth, inexorable, terrifying pull. The Phoenix moved forward with a relentless, tidal momentum, as if the laws of friction and gravity were merely suggestions it had chosen to ignore. It passed the 100-foot mark. It passed the 150-foot mark where Gentry's technological marvel had failed. The sled, a monster designed to stop even the most powerful machines in their tracks, seemed to glide behind it. The crowd was on its feet, a collective gasp rippling through the stands. They were witnessing something impossible. This rust bucket, this pile of junk, was performing a miracle. Leo felt a wild, exultant joy surge through him, a feeling so pure and powerful it almost brought him to tears. The engine roared its defiance, a 50-year-old cry of vindication that shook the very air. He pushed the throttle further, and the Phoenix pulled and pulled and pulled until it reached the very end of the track. A full pull. For a moment after he cut the engine, the only sound was the percussive ticking of hot metal contracting in the sudden silence. The silence was absolute, a vacuum of collective disbelief. Then, the fairgrounds erupted. It was a roar of applause, of cheers, of stunned, joyous shouting that washed over Leo in a tidal wave. He had done it. He hadn't just won. He had shattered every expectation. He had taken the symbol of his humiliation and turned it into a legend. He looked over at the sidelines. Gentry stood frozen, his face a mask of chalky white shock. His jaw was slack, his eyes wide with a dawning horror that was far more satisfying to Leo than any prize money. And a few rose up in the stands, an elderly man in a tweed jacket, a man Leo would later learn was Harrison Vance, the most famous collector of rare agricultural machinery in the country, was clutching his chest, his eyes fixed on the Phoenix's exposed engine block. He swayed on his feet, his face pale, and then, with a quiet sigh, he fainted dead away. The win was absolute. The catharsis was complete. The Phoenix had risen from the ashes, and in its fire, Gentry's world was beginning to burn. The aftermath of the pull was chaos, a whirlwind of noise and motion that swirled around Leo and the silent, triumphant Phoenix. People swarmed him, clapping him on the back, shaking his hand, their earlier mockery forgotten and replaced with a fervent, almost fearful respect. They asked a torrent of questions he couldn't answer, their voices a jumble of how. And what is that thing? Old Man Hemlock approached, his straw hat clutched in his hands, his weathered face a mixture of awe and profound shame. Leo, I ain't never seen anything like it. I was wrong about you, son. Dead wrong. Leo just nodded, too overwhelmed by the tide of emotion and adrenaline to speak. Paramedics were attending to Harrison Vance, the collector who had fainted. As they helped him to a chair and gave him water, his eyes, now wide and lucid, never left the tractor. He kept muttering the same thing over and over to his frantic assistant. It's real. After all these years, it's real. The event judges, looking as stunned as everyone else, officially declared him the winner and presented Leo with an oversized check for $25,000. He held it in his grease-stained hands, the flimsy cardboard feeling heavier and more substantial than a bar of gold. This was it. The workshop was safe, more than safe. He had done the impossible, but the most potent moment of his victory was yet to come. Through the parting crowd, Marcus Gentry appeared. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a desperate, hurried shuffle. His face was pale, his eyes darting between Leo and the Phoenix, a frantic, panicked calculation happening behind them. He had clearly overheard the collector's gasps, seen the way experts in the crowd were now circling the machine, whispering in hushed, reverent tones. The gears of his greedy mind were turning, connecting the dots of his catastrophic, world-altering mistake. He stopped in front of Leo, his voice a strained, wheedling whisper that was a pathetic imitation of his former booming confidence. "Miller, Leo, a word." He gestured for Leo to step away from the adoring crowd. Reluctantly, Leo followed him to the edge of the staging area, the massive check still clutched in his hand. "Look," Gentry started, fumbling for his words, his composure shattered. "I might have been a little hasty, a little harsh. Business is business, you understand." He couldn't even look Leo in the eye, his gaze fixed hungrily on the tractor. "That machine, it's impressive, more than I realized." Leo waited, his silence a wall of granite. His expression was unreadable. "I'll tell you what," Gentry said, trying to force a magnanimous smile that looked more like a grimace of pain. "Let's call it even. I'll pay you what I owed you, the full 10,000 in cash, right now." He reached for his wallet. "And we'll forget this whole misunderstanding. You can just give me back my old tractor." The audacity of it was breathtaking, a monument to arrogance. After the public humiliation, the lies, the weeks of starvation and struggle Leo had endured because of this man, Gentry thought he could wipe it all away with the very money he had stolen. He still believed the world operated on his terms, that everything and everyone had a price tag he could meet. Leo looked from Gentry's desperate face to the iron Phoenix, its scarred metal glowing like an ember in the setting sun. He thought of the long nights in the workshop, the blood on his knuckles, the heart-stopping moment he'd uncovered that small brass plate. He had poured his soul into that machine. It wasn't just a tractor anymore. It was a part of him. It was his resurrection. "My tractor?" Leo asked, his voice quiet but as solid and unyielding as forged steel. "Well, yes," Gentry sputtered, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. "Technically, it was on my land. A Gentry family heirloom, you could say." A slow, cold smile touched Leo's lips. It was Gentry's smile, the one from the office, but on Leo's face it was transformed. It wasn't cruel, it was victorious. He finally looked Gentry directly in the eye, and for the first time he saw the man for what he truly was, small, hollow, and utterly terrified. "No," Leo said. The word was not loud, but it cut through the air with the absolute finality of a judge's gavel. Gentry blinked, uncomprehending. "What? Look, I'll even add another 5,000, a finder's fee, 15,000. That's more money than you'll see in a year." Leo held up the oversized check from the competition, the words "grand prize" emblazoned across it. "I don't need your money, Mr. Gentry." He then looked at the Phoenix, his expression softening with a genuine affection that a man like Gentry could never comprehend. "You see, you thought you were paying me with junk. You thought you were giving me something worthless just to get rid of me. But I didn't restore this for you. I didn't win for you. And I sure as hell didn't do any of this for your money." He turned his gaze back to Gentry, his eyes as clear and hard as diamonds. "I did it for the machine, because it deserved better." He turned and walked away, leaving Gentry standing alone in the dust, his useless offer dissolving into the twilight. In that moment, Leo understood something profound. Gentry hadn't just given away a $1 million prototype. He had given away something far more valuable, the chance to see the beauty in something broken, the honor in hard work, and the priceless value of a second chance. And that was a lesson Gentry, with all his money, would never be able to afford. The day after the tractor pull, Leo walked into the county bank, the $25,000 check in his hand. The air inside was cool and silent, smelling of recycled air and old paper. The same teller who had given him pitying looks for months, who had spoken to him in the slow, careful tone one uses for the terminally ill, now greeted him with a wide, sycophantic smile. The foreclosure on Miller and Son Mechanics was canceled, the debt paid in full. As the teller stamped the final document with a satisfying thud, a weight Leo had carried for so long it had become a part of his posture, a part of his soul, finally lifted from his shoulders. He walked out of the bank and into the bright sunlight a free man. He didn't stop there. With the remaining money, he didn't buy a new truck or fancy equipment. He invested in his father's legacy. He paid for a new, gleaming metal roof for the workshop, silencing the leaks that had dripped like a water clock counting down to their demise. He bought a state-of-the-art diagnostic system, and with a deep sense of satisfaction, he hunted down and repurchased the very same models of antique tools he had been forced to sell, reclaiming pieces of his family's history. He even repainted the faded sign himself, the words Miller and Son Mechanics gleaming in fresh, bold letters, a declaration to the world that they had not only survived, but returned. His father, who had been watching his son's obsessive work with worried, fearful eyes, now worked alongside him, the old spark of passion for his craft rekindled. The workshop, once a place of quiet desperation and encroaching shadows, was now filled with the sounds of renewal and the steady, confident hum of new work. News of the Iron Phoenix spread far beyond the county line, becoming a whisper, then a roar in the world of high-end collectors. Harrison Vance, the man who had fainted, made a full recovery and was Leo's first official client. He didn't want to buy the Phoenix. He understood it was priceless and belonged with the man who had resurrected it. Instead, he hired Leo to restore other rare pieces from his vast collection, paying him fees that were once unthinkable. Soon, other collectors and agricultural enthusiasts came calling. They didn't just want a mechanic. They wanted the artist who had breathed life back into a legend. The workshop became a hub, a mecca for those who understood that true value wasn't in a new coat of paint or a factory warranty, but in the history and soul of a machine. The fate of Marcus Gentry was a different story. A slow, quiet collapse played out in public filings and courthouse whispers. His spectacular failure at the tractor pull was the first crack in his carefully constructed facade of invincibility. The story of how he'd thrown away the priceless Iron Phoenix became a local legend, a cautionary tale told in diners and feed stores with knowing smirks. He became a laughingstock, the man whose arrogance had blinded him to a fortune sitting in his own backyard. The bets he'd lost against Leo cost him a small fortune, but the damage to his reputation was immeasurable and fatal. Business partners grew wary. Lenders became cautious. His empire, built on a shaky foundation of intimidation and inherited wealth, began to crumble under the weight of his own foolishness. A series of bad, desperate investments, fueled by a frantic need to reclaim his status, turned sour, One by one, his assets were leveraged, then liquidated to cover the margins. 6 months after the tractor pull, a new set of flyers went up around the county. They weren't for a celebration, but for an auction. The Gentry estate, the thousands of acres of perfect corn, the massive house with its mahogany-paneled office. It was all being sold off, piece by humiliating piece, to cover his crushing debts. Leo drove out there on the day of the auction. He didn't go to bid. He parked his old truck on the road overlooking the property and just watched. He saw the auctioneer on the steps of the grand house, his voice a fast, rhythmic chant that was dismantling a dynasty. He saw Gentry's gleaming, high-tech farm equipment, including the black Fent that had failed so spectacularly, being sold off for pennies on the dollar to his smiling rivals. He saw Gentry himself, standing near the back of the crowd, a shrunken gray figure, a ghost haunting the ruins of his own kingdom. Their eyes met for a brief moment across the field. There was no triumph in Leo's gaze, no gloating, only a quiet, final acknowledgement of a debt paid in full. Leo didn't stay to see the end. He had work to do. He turned his truck around and drove back to his workshop, where the Iron Phoenix stood in the place of honor. He ran a hand along its scarred, unpainted fender. Gentry had taught him a valuable lesson, one that had saved his life. True value is never about what something costs. It's about what someone is willing to see, to care for, to believe in. Gentry had seen a pile of rust. Leo had seen a soul of iron waiting for a second chance. And in saving it, he had saved himself. The deep, resonant hum of its legendary engine was now the heartbeat of his future, a future he had built not with money, but with his own 2 hands. And so, their destiny was forged, a new legacy built from the ashes of the old. Their story now belongs to time, but its power only grows if shared. True value isn't in what something costs, but in what someone is willing to care for. But as one man breaks the system, another is trapped by it. What happens when the machine you build to win your freedom is the one that ultimately enslaves you? If this journey marked your soul, leave a like and subscribe. For the best stories are those that refuse to die in silence.